Hello and welcome to Crownsmen Energy. I am your host, Chad Carrier. Coming up on the show today, we have a returning guest, Jackson Hegland from the Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance. Jackson was last on the show about a year ago talking about MELA, the Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance, and how it's an industry partner to help create a clean economy. So we're going to unpack that interview right away shortly and get into some of the developments that have happened over the last year or so. But before we do that, let's bring in Gaudy Molina to introduce today's show sponsors.
Okay, so today we've got total combustion. If you are in the oil and gas industry, you know that the regulations to deal with waste gas are always changing and becoming more stringent. Not all companies can afford to go net zero. Because all waste gas is not pipeline quality, combustion is a viable solution. That is where Total Combustion Inc. comes in with the most reliable combustion solutions on the market. Need to buy or rent waste gas combustion equipment? Need to eliminate unscheduled downtime and lower your operation costs? Call Total Combustion at 403 309 7731 or email them at sales@tciburners.com to learn more. Next up, we have SolarSet. SolarSet has launched pre assembled ground mounted solar systems, including the innovative SolarSet Fold. Their solar systems will power your residential and commercial property, and they also ship worldwide. Talk to their team to learn if a grid tie or off grid with battery backup solar system is right for your application. Visit solarset.com to learn more. And next up, we also have Integra. Integra helps pipeline owners and operators reduce risk and minimize costs, delivering the clearest picture of pipeline health using industry leading ultra high resolution inline inspection technologies, collecting multiple data sets on one tool run. Data resolution up to 4 times greater than other ILI tools, human based data analysis, and experience providing the highest quality inspection results available. The Integra ILI system delivers for their pipeline industry partners whose success depends on safety and reliability. See more, know more. Visit integrasolutions.com now. And last but not least, we have PowerZone. When you need a specialized team of world class engineers for your oil and gas pipelines, dewatering, or any fluid handling needs, you want to visit powerzone.com. In addition to their inventory of rebuilt pumps, motors, engines, they also have an amazing team to design and engineer your systems, no matter the challenge, no matter the location. Get in the zone with PowerZone. Visit them at powerzone.com.
Okay, thank you, Gaudy. Okay, Jackson Hegland, let's introduce you back to Crownsman Energy. As we mentioned, you are the executive director of the Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back on Crownsman Energy.
Well, thanks a lot for having us, Chad. It's a great opportunity just to increase the dialogue and keep things moving along in this space. And lots happening, notwithstanding, the crazy world we've been in here the last couple of years. So thanks again for having us and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, we really appreciate you coming back on the show. And you're right, there's been a lot of developments that have happened with respect to energy over the past few years. None more so than probably the last year with a lot of things changing. As we mentioned, you were on Crownsman Energy speaking with Jared about a year ago now. Since then, a lot has changed. A lot has happened in the methane emissions reductions portfolio. But before we get into some of the new developments, I was hoping that you could maybe refresh us on MELA's mission concerning methane emissions reduction in oil and natural gas.
Sure. Yeah, Chad, we're an industry association, and we've got about 40 members across Canada and the US, and some head offices in Europe as well, of methane emission mitigation technologies and service providers. And the focus certainly is on the upstream oil and gas sector for the solutions that we provide. And that very much is our focus when we look at policy development, program development, and implementation at the field level. But certainly our members have services and technologies that apply beyond the upstream oil and gas sector. But, from a very singular mission perspective and where we've always deemed the opportunity to be over the last half a decade here, and certainly moving forward over the next half a decade, that's where we've remained focused. It's been really, it's one of the more rewarding components of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis is engaging with these members, because you're dealing with innovators and you're dealing with people that really are focused on business for good, for lack of a better term, to be honest. And it happens to be more fitting that these businesses, have progressed along with this movement around corporate sustainability and ESG performance, things that are really cotton on in the last couple of years as the global economy has been through some ebbs and flows. So I don't know. It's a lot of fun to be a part of this, Chad, but it's particularly rewarding to see how all the stakeholders are really committed now to moving this file forward as far as investment is concerned and implementation, and really seeing these technologies and services get to work.
And you raise an interesting point, Jackson, because you're absolutely right. From someone who works in the industry myself, it's really exciting to see, companies and organizations such as yourself really push this portfolio forward, because it is so critical. And to see just how engaged the stakeholders are is just a wonderful thing. To bring it to what you guys are working towards, from the last interview with Jared, you mentioned measurement, mitigation, and monitoring, kind of the three M's, or the three critical pieces to managing methane. Can you expand upon that, or break that down for our listeners and viewers in terms of how do these contribute to reductions, both from an industry perspective and a service provider perspective?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, Chad, because everybody needs to pull the same rope on this. But in order to do that, we need to have really good data. And that's not news to the sector. In any part of the upstream oil and gas sector, we've needed better data in order to improve the performance, in order to drive investment into certain technologies. And that remains the case here in methane mitigation. Now, we've been in a more fortunate position here in Canada in particular, where we're seeing greater implementation of these technologies because the data is getting better, because we've got a new set of regulations that are requiring industry members to measure and then report on their performance in this space. And that immediately opens their eyes to where the opportunities exist, and then consequently which technologies and services they need to pursue in order to continue on that pathway of continuous improvement, not just from a regulatory compliance perspective, but certainly as companies ramp up their ESG ambition as well. There's greater focus on finding the most economic solutions in order to mitigate emissions, not just today, of course, but into the future, because it does two things. And again, we're very fortunate in Canada to have these type of pathways that exist. One is you minimize your future cost of compliance. So implement technologies today. They should be in place for a number of years, regardless of how the regulations change over time. You're minimizing that risk and that future cost of compliance. But we also have a beneficial system here as far as the carbon offset system is concerned, because any pre-compliance activities now, of course, you can be generating revenue for these investments that you make into technologies. So you essentially can be generating revenue or banking on compliance credits into the future, or selling those credits to market today, generating some revenue and possibly reinvesting it into more implementation of these technologies to then minimize your future cost of compliance. And of course, along the way, what you're getting is improved data. The more technologies that go into the field, the more services that go into the field to give you your inventory, not just your equipment inventory, but your emissions inventory. Also provides service providers that do emissions quantification to grow. It also, provides better sources of data. The sector is getting, I think, a little bit better at sharing information. Some of it is due to the regulations and public information access, but others is really trying to share the information to really source out the most economic solutions, and those continue to evolve over time, largely due to some of the government funding that's out there, and we can get into that at some point as well.
Absolutely, and that's something I did definitely want to touch on here shortly, because I know there have been some funding initiatives and some new announcements over the past year with respect to government. But just speaking on that data piece, as you mentioned, being so critical to moving this file forward, can you walk us through the 6 primary areas in methane mitigation that are being regulated?
Yeah, I mean, it varies a little bit, Chad, across across jurisdictions slightly. I mean, but for the most part, your leak detection is really a critical one, that, you're looking at different frequencies and types of technologies that are required to be used. for leak detection. This is largely surrounding your fugitive emissions and vented emission volumes. The reason why that's such a critical piece and really consistent across all the regulations is to our previous point around improving the data, because historically fugitive emissions, by no means did they have to be captured in any sort of data management system, and consequently they're a moderate health and safety risk on one hand, but then on the other, of course, you've got the climate impact of methane as opposed to carbon dioxide. So that's a really critical one. Compressors, tanks, we're not quite there yet, although generally those can be captured under site vent limits, of course, but that's an evolving space around data collection and hopefully a space that continues to evolve here in the future around some solutions regarding tanks. And then of course, engines, compressors, things of that nature, and pneumatic devices, which are really your lowest hanging fruit at this point for mitigation opportunities, but also frankly from a regulation perspective, because the opportunity to install solutions, multiple different solutions, whether that's greening the power that's being used on site, or greening or using renewable energy to power some of these devices. Really neat area that has certainly evolved over the last couple of years as well.
And let's talk about the membership there, Jackson. In terms, you mentioned some of the different areas where the technology sits, such as leak detection. But let's expand upon your members and how are they advancing positive change with respect to lowering methane emissions.
Man, Chad, it's been really neat to see how this moves. We've got several members that have been involved in the sector for years, but have continued to innovate along the way as they've seen different opportunities for solutions, and they continue to be innovators in this space and providing new technologies and service into the market. But probably where we're seeing the most movement at this point, certainly, is on the leak detection side, because you've got multiple different types of leak detection technologies now, whereas historically it was largely focused around optical gas imaging cameras, which remain extremely effective because you've got boots on the ground and folks walking around your site in order to find all of the leaks and vents. But there's multiple new technologies now evolving as far as sensors are concerned, and these can be mounted on trucks. So driving around a site, you can get a bit of a sense of what the emission sources are. Airplanes, drones, satellites, go down the list, or go up in the atmosphere, so to speak, in that regard. But with each of those heights of detection, you've also got different detection technologies that exist within that space. So it's not just an evolution as far as the type of mode of transportation. There's fence mounted sensors as well that provide continuous monitoring. So you can see now the portfolio around leak detection has really went from two sources, where essentially it was humans and optical gas imaging cameras, now to probably half a dozen different types of methodologies. And then on top of that, you've got multiple different sensor technologies now based on each of those different types of methodologies.
And the technology alone, just with respect to that space, is truly incredible. And as we know, working in the industry, technology is one piece, collaboration is another piece, and then of course, the larger stakeholder picture in terms of government incentives and how companies are able to further pursue their technologies through different programs, grants, initiatives. Let's get into some of the new developments that have happened around methane emissions over the last, roughly year or so. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in October of 2021, Canada committed its support towards a global methane pledge designed to slash emissions. Can you walk us through that announcement and what it means for all of the stakeholders?
Well, Chad, there's been a fair number of announcements here that apply to this scenario. And when the liberal government made an adjustment in their cabinet and appointed a new minister in this space. There were some very clear directives for the minister that relate specifically to this type of target setting in emissions management, in not just in the oil and gas sector, but broadly as a country. So across the economy. And, the focus historically has been on, in the case of methane from the upstream oil and gas sectors, 45% reduction in methane emissions. And that's now being ramped up to 75%.
Okay.
So it's whether or not the policy gets there, I think is a piece that we're all waiting to see how it shakes out. And
Mhm.
I guess maybe I'll walk a little bit cautiously through this space because there's a lot of levers here at play, not just politically, but then, given the current regulatory landscape and some adjustments that may or may not need to happen within the current regulatory landscape, the evolution of technology and what that means for the economics of these regulations is also a factor that the government considers. And as I mentioned, the political interplay between the provinces and the federal government is a critical piece to this, and whether or not the feds can achieve their their federal mandate around a new target, which again is tied to the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, which are something that Canada has committed to and subsequently ramped up at the most recent Conference of Parties in Glasgow in November of last year. It's all interconnected, the international landscape to the domestic landscape, and how those targets progress is so dependent upon the different levers in the policy and regulatory world that it's a space that you need to navigate carefully. I think the point, Chad, is that whether you're looking locally at the provincial level, nationally, whether you're looking at other countries, because each country is managing this methane issue slightly differently. There's generally a concerted effort globally to focus on methane reduction from the upstream oil and gas sector, and we're talking about relatively short timeframes: 2025 interim targets, 2030 targets, and then broadly net zero in 2050. So, I wouldn't be so sure that 2 years ago people were looking at 2030 quite as seriously as they are now. But I think everyone's looking at that time frame and the targets associated with it as, holy smokes, it's going to be here pretty quick.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's expediting in terms of the urgency and everyone reaching those targets. As we speak towards that, of course, technology is always a huge piece, which you have alluded to earlier in this interview. But technologically speaking, are there are there any aspects that are lacking or gaps that may still need to be addressed in mitigating methane emissions?
Yeah, Chad, there's given how much work is happening in the space right now to pilot test new technologies, to get better data, to analyze the data that is being reported through the regulator, particularly here in Alberta. I think there really remains a couple gaps in we address one of them being tanks. Certainly a challenging space to find mitigation activities. There's multiple ways you can look at that, of course. One is very specifically at the vents coming from the tanks. And then, of course, looking upstream from the tanks to try and determine if there's any way to manage the mix of product that's going into the tank that ultimately affects the vent rate. So there's ongoing work there, but really even just the measurement of tank vents is something that is continues to be tested today. Natural Gas Innovation Fund is running an emissions testing center right now that is testing some of these technologies. Many of them are our members, and so we'll get better information in that space. And frankly, there's been work on tank management for a number of years, and so people are continue to be in this space trying to figure it out. And the next would be probably methane slip from engines. It's an interesting piece that that has gotten a fair bit more awareness here over the past 6 to 12 months for sure. Certainly, many organizations have been aware of it for a longer period of time, but certainly in the conversations that I've had over the last year, it's something that has sort of come to the forefront. as these other pieces are moving along the way.
And that's an interesting point, and this might be a bit of a digression, but the methane slips, for example, these are all terms that the general public may or may not be aware of, but they're still critical and crucial to their everyday impact as well. How are organizations and partnerships and alliances such as yourself as a Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance, how are you guys helping to really push that portfolio forward and better educate not only just industry but the public as a whole?
Well, maybe the most honest answer I could give you is not enough. I think it's a fair point that we need to be out there with better information. And there was a lot happening in the communication space about 5 years ago, certainly when BC, Alberta, and federally, each of those jurisdictions were looking at developing methane regulations. So there was a lot of workshops and engagement sessions and things of that nature where key stakeholders were getting together to have discussion and communicate where the needs were and where the gaps were and what the policy piece might look like, and then subsequently the regulatory design. Since that time, there's no doubt about the fact that COVID has put a serious damper into that piece. I can tell you from our experience with MELA, I think we canceled about 5 or 6 international trips where we were going to be out in front of other stakeholders across the globe. And this is the Middle East, this is Europe, and this is the US and Canada. And we had events booked in each of those locations with some very significant stakeholders in this space to communicate what's happening and the type of information that we have and what we're finding here in Canada, which is a very sophisticated jurisdiction as far as methane management is concerned from the upstream oil and gas sector, arguably the best in the world. And taking that to the other parts of the globe to say, hey, here's some solutions that you can implement now. Here's how you get better data, and this is what you do with it. Well, that went a little bit sideways. And, you can really only do so much of that engagement, as we all know now, through video calls, of course. Still effective in some ways, but something we're going to look to pick up again here this year, starting with the Global Energy Show here in Calgary in June.
And that's a great segue. As we all see things start to resume, face-to-face in-person activity with the global show coming up in June. Speaking to Alberta specifically, as you mentioned, and Canada as a whole, as a sophisticated jurisdiction, I love that term because it's so true. And I find that a lot of times Alberta and Canada help, are an incubator for technology, ideas, thought processes, and then it takes hold elsewhere. How is this province, is Alberta leading the way with respect to methane emissions and just the clean technology portfolio as a whole?
I think, Chad, we're very fortunate in some regards. Although it does create some costs for the sector, which do need to be managed. But insofar as motivating change and implementation, and getting these technologies out in the field, the reason why we are in a better position in Alberta is because there's been this portfolio of influencers, and that's both the policy and regulatory piece. It's carbon offset system, and it's funding. So whether that's government funding, whether it's private funding, there's a lot of dollars that have been going into the pilot testing and R&D and implementation of methane mitigation technologies. So when you have, as we talked about, when you have a regulatory driver, that's a pretty significant stick where companies are looking at, what the liability looks like to their assets and saying we need to do something. Then you've got the carbon offset system that says, hey, you can generate revenue from making change on site to minimize your emissions profile. And then on top of that, you can get government funding or private funding to implement any of those changes. So the capital cost obviously improves because the NPV on many of these projects can be a little bit strained under a historically low commodity price environment. Obviously a little bit different now. Companies are managing their funds a little bit differently as well, notwithstanding the higher commodity prices. But hey, that's certainly the way that they need to focus on their business. But we've had that environment here in Alberta for a long time. And it certainly has ramped up in the last 4 years in particular, and even more so in the last 2 years, since the regulatory reported data has come in, and the funding dollars have frankly increased quite a bit in that time frame as well.
And with that funding, Jackson, I know you did expand upon that in your last interview here with us at Crownsmen Energy. But I wonder, from a public and a private sense, is there enough funding? Is what's out there, is that enough right now, or is more needed?
Well, it depends how you define enough.
Right.
It's and that's a fair question, to be honest. I think it's a fair comment for anybody to say what is enough in this space. And there's certainly more dollars that need to go into the space. There's certainly more R&D that needs to happen. There's certainly more contributions to support the implementation of some of these maybe uneconomic projects today, but in the absence of them, we can't move the dial in as quick a manner as we otherwise would be able to, which frankly we need to, again, looking at these short timelines, 2030, 2050, that we're dealing with in this space. So you know there's always opportunity for more. The challenge, of course, is stakeholder influence on that. Should the oil and gas sector, however people define that, be getting subsidies? Well, that's certainly something that the federal government is looking to address, and others continue to discuss along the way. Well, is supporting R&D and is supporting clean technology actually a subsidy to the oil and gas sector? Some people would argue no, because some people would argue, look, you're supporting clean tech jobs, you're supporting a whole new industry, and you're supporting exportable technologies, which is really significant because you've got a jobs growth opportunity domestically, and you have clean tech growth internationally when you look at exporting these technologies. So this is a piece, Chad, that is a really significant focus for us as an organization this year and moving forward, is the opportunity that exists to take our domestic knowledge, our domestic technologies, and get them into other markets, because we know that we can achieve greater global reductions in the upstream oil and gas sector with deployment of readily available proven technologies from here in Canada. And that can't be overlooked in this space. We can talk all day long about how sophisticated we are as a jurisdiction here in Alberta and Canada, and that's great. And we should leverage that. And the way to leverage that, in our view, is to get out there, as you were saying, how much communication can we do in education? But get out there in the market and really say, listen, this is doable, it's achievable. Whether you are a regulated entity in whatever jurisdiction you're operating or not, there's an opportunity to be better. And so if it's this combination, it's this combination of taking what we have here, deploying it in other jurisdictions, but the partnerships that are required to make that happen are really significant and take a lot of time.
And those partnerships, as you mentioned, are case in point as to what MELA and your organization is doing. As I look to your members, there's an expansive list there, and some incredible companies, like you said, that are innovative, leading the way. And as you talk about taking the technologies and the methodologies, the ideologies, whatever you want to call it, and expanding that to other jurisdictions, as you mentioned in your last question or your last answer, that a lot's being done there. But what's the next step in that evolution in terms of taking that to the larger market?
Well, I think it's getting all the stakeholders on the same page. And it's really understanding that we can toe the same line together, and it's going to take collaboration rather than confrontation. There's no doubt about it. And to your point, it's going to take a lot more education. We walk a fine line in this space because you've got different governments and different jurisdictions with different objectives. You've got companies that are saying, hey, this is a competitive advantage for us, whether that's a technology or a service, or whether it's an upstream oil and gas producer that's saying, hey, listen, we're willing to invest in all of this. It's going to differentiate our product So that's a competitive advantage to us. And these are all fair pieces of the puzzle that we need to navigate. And so you've got data sharing requirements in order to improve the visibility of the performance of these technologies. You've got R&D that's happening that frankly can help move some of these technologies into other jurisdictions that have different reservoir composition or different above ground needs, things of that nature, operating in different environments. All of these things are critical to how these technologies evolve and whether or not they're applicable in other jurisdictions. And so that requires a lot of work and a lot of partnerships, not just with foreign governments, not just with foreign oil and gas companies, and not just with foreign service providers, who in many jurisdictions need to be the ones that are working with the technology providers to get those tech into the upstream producer world in the jurisdictions in which they operate, because that's just how those jurisdictions operate. You need to have boots on the ground that are local in order to make that happen. Working with Canadian and provincial trade commissioners is another piece of this, which we've spent a fair bit of time in the last year and a half doing. So a lot of moving parts, Chad. Maybe it can be viewed as something that keeps me employed. I don't know, but it's fun work too.
Oh, it is, and it's critical, crucial work. What yourself and your organization is doing. Is so critical to moving this portfolio forward and achieving these aggressive targets in terms of clean technology deployment. In your last answer got me thinking as well. You see so much innovation with certain companies, a lot of R&D components to it, and we know sometimes there can be the opportunity to share that knowledge but there can also be a business case made for each company respectively. So is there enough stakeholder collaboration happening right now, or is there more that could be done from the various stakeholders in terms of cross-pollinating some of these ideas?
It's better than ever, Chad. It's certainly been a message that we've carried to our members since day one. 5.5 years ago is, look, the path forward goes through collaboration. And as much as many of the organizations within our group are competitors, there's also opportunities to collaborate, not just with similar solutions or technologies, but obviously when you've got complementary services and collaborating together. And now what we're seeing is this happening all the time. You've got the clean technology providers that are saying, hey, listen, we need someone that can help us distribute the product and educate folks on it. So we're looking at partnerships with electrical or instrumentation or other service companies that otherwise wouldn't be bringing these technologies forward. So then the clean tech is spending time educating really one stakeholder that then can go out and reach, say, an additional 20. And it's a really efficient way of getting some of these technologies out into the market. And it's happening domestically, and it's happening a fair bit actually with our members in the US as well. A little bit different approach when you get outside of North America, of course, or Canada and the US in particular. But it's happening a lot. And if you're ever scrolling through LinkedIn and following all of our members, which I'm pretty sure everybody here does, if not, they really should. But you really get a good sense of these partnerships and what they're doing and how it's improving the efficiency of the deployment. And everybody's pretty happy doing it together.
Well, it's great to hear, because as you expand on that, you see different companies, the more collaboration, I'm sure, as you've seen with your members, there's massive benefits to being a part of an organization such as yourself, because there's, new ways of doing things or new access to different markets that they may not have thought about or seen if they weren't part of an organization such as yourself. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is for sure. And, like anything, really, there's strength in numbers. And so, when you talk a little bit about, how do we continue to move this forward? Well, certainly the collaboration piece is one, but, organizations like ours or other industry associations like PTAC or go down the list. There's just great opportunity to get together and have conversations about what's working, what's not working, and where does money need to flow, and how do we start sharing data? How do we understand the data? These are all conversations that are happening today. Hopefully it continues to grow.
And with that data itself, Jackson, is that, and I don't mean to be presumptuous, but is that, really the key to all of this? Is that data, obtaining it, sharing it, expanding upon it?
Yeah, I would say it is. But maybe even one umbrella piece above those three that you mentioned, Chad, is normalization, so that everybody's looking at the same data in the same way. That's a process. It's going to take time. As we talked about, from leak detection alone, you've got multiple different sensor technologies. They're going to be collecting data in a different way. And then of course there's the proprietary nature of data management systems that exist, whether that's within an upstream oil and gas organization, or whether that's a proprietary system that a technology or solution provider has developed. Improved algorithms or more efficient methodologies, or they're drawing off of different data inputs. These are all pieces that I certainly don't have a crystal ball on it. Layer in, of course, government funding programs then that are collecting additional information out of each of these individual systems. But the government programs need to collect that information in a certain way as well, because they're accountable to the dollars that are going out the door and need to be understanding what type of information is being collected. So yeah, on one hand, is it critical to the secret sauce of how we really continue to advance this file? It certainly is. But there's a certain amount of collaboration that needs to happen. There's a certain number of assumptions that we need to accept together and move forward from. And I think with those two things, and we can continue to progress maybe a little bit quicker, as opposed to getting bogged down by all the data and bogged down by some of the barriers that exist with data sharing.
And what are some of those assumptions, Jackson, that we should accept to help move this forward?
Maybe this one isn't an assumption, but one of the things that would really be helpful is very consistent quantification methodologies for all of the emission sources. And that it is monumental impact in this space to ensure that we have consistent quantification methodologies, and then the variables that we use as inputs into those models needs to be consistent. So it needs, in our case, and this is a challenging, Chad, because we talked a little bit about jurisdictional variance in production profiles, and that's hard to capture when you're looking at comparing carbon intensity of natural gas production from Canada to natural gas production in a different jurisdiction, or oil production as well. It as much as there has been work in this space, and there continues to be work in this space around looking at the life cycle emissions impact of production from natural gas and oil sands, it's challenging to really compare the carbon intensity of these products across global jurisdictions, because as we've been talking about, if we have better data here in Canada as a result of this system that we've talked about, and other jurisdictions don't, and therefore they're using estimates.
Right.
They're using assumptions that we don't have to use because we have better data. Well, is that good for our sector, or is that bad for our sector? And there's going to be arguments in both directions. So how that all shakes out, Chad, this is really a roundabout way of me saying that as much as I can talk about the importance of data, it's really hard for me to put a fence around the critical pieces, because there's so many of them.
And that's completely understandable, because it is a huge file, and you're right. Sometimes it's not always created equal in terms of access to data, or as you mentioned, the assumptions or the actual data that may be present. This is a lofty question, and it speaks to looking ahead. But what do you see in terms from MELA's perspective? What's next for industry? Where do we go from here?
Well, hopefully wherever we go, we're going together. There's really not a better way to put it than that, because when we put our guard up, it's human nature and corporate nature to hold more to our chest. And as we've been talking about, that can be problematic in how quickly the implementation of these solutions moves forward, and how quickly we come to solve some of these critical issues around methane slip and tank venting. So that's a risk, and that's a barrier to this. But what will solve much of that certainly is data availability. And I hate to sort of keep repeating the same things, but really, Chad, it comes down to these basic pieces. And as I said, I think we need to get together as a group of stakeholders to accept a few things. And one would be that climate mitigation activities are business imperative. And let's all work together to improve the economics of the solutions. So, we're supporting a robust economy, for frankly a lack of a better term, and we're all trying to de-risk capital allocation. So those are, that's the high level piece around how we certainly look at this, and how we think that this can and should move forward, is come to some common understanding around business imperative, and then working together to improve the economics of the solutions, so that we can build a really robust energy sector here for years to come.
And there's massive potential in doing so, to do that from a multitude of stakeholder perspectives. Jackson, before we wrap up, let's bring it all together in terms of talking about the potential that lies here, not only from an ESG perspective, environmental stewardship, but from a business investor and overall stakeholder position.
Well, I at the expense of perhaps reiterating some of the stuff that we just talked about, when you look at capital flows and the investor environment and capital markets at this point, there's certainly sophistication there that has evolved over the last couple of years, and there's a confluence of factors that have influenced those capital markets and reinvigorated how they look at investment into clean tech, and how they look at the requirement for ESG ambition from the upstream oil and gas sector, because we're getting more clarity as each day goes by around assets at risk. And so that's in part due to improved data. It's in part due to improved quantification methodologies and all these things we've been talking about. There again, it's a systematic movement that we're seeing in this space, and where it's probably had as much influence as anywhere else in the market is in the investor space, in the capital markets. And we speak with folks in the capital markets all the time around how they're looking at where their investment opportunities exist. And we help them understand how it relates directly to the upstream oil and gas sector, whether you're talking hydrogen, whether you're talking CCS, and the list goes on. There's an opportunity to improve that dialogue, and we're in a really great position as a sector here in Canada to have that conversation because of the system that we've been living in for the past 14 years.
And to me, it just seems like it's an ever evolving, incredibly exciting space that, as you mentioned, there's so many facets to it, and it's only growing and expanding as jurisdictions look to employ these technologies. And I just think it's great that organizations such as yourself are here on the forefront and taking the time to speak with us today and educate our viewers and our listeners. So we really appreciate your time and your expertise and being an advocate for clean technology. So thank you, Jackson, for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks again, Chad, and Crownsmen as a whole, the organization. It's always fun having the conversation, and like I said, it's an important part of moving this forward. So we appreciate the opportunity here.
Well, and we appreciate your time because as we chat, there's so many things, there's so many avenues that we could get to. So we certainly hope to have you back for a third interview, because this is a portfolio that, as we said, is only getting exponentially bigger with each and every day. So again, truly appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chad.
All right, well, that just about does it for today's episode of Crownsmen Energy. But as we mentioned, with having Jackson on the show, there's so many incredible topics that we can talk about and expand upon as things change, as regulations change. So please feel free to get involved with us. You can follow all of our different social pages, check out our website, watch all of our shows, and feel free to recommend guests and any different ideas that you may find interesting on an upcoming episode. So from all of us here at Crownsmen Energy, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and we will see you next time on Crownsmen Energy.